Today. Today is Sunday, 8th September, and today is one of those days where we have heavy fog of war over most of the Ukrainian battlefields, which makes it extremely difficult for those of us who are far away from those battlefields and who are not privy to the secrets of the general staffs on either side, people like myself, in other words, to have a very exact idea of what is going on. I know that there's all kinds of speculations and rumours based to a certain extent on what people who are closer to the situation on the battlefronts are saying, but overall one gets a sense that an awful lot is being kept from us intentionally, I suspect, and in truth, whenever that happens, what we discover over the next couple of weeks is that there have been significant Russian advances. That has been my consistent experience when fog of war situations emerge over the battlefronts in Ukraine. One of the points I would make, again, when discussing the state of the battlefronts in Ukraine, is that, as has now become clear to me, it was not so clear previously, but it's become clear to me that a lot of neutral bloggers take most of their information, a lot of their information, from what the Ukrainians say about the situation on the battlefronts and assume that it must be true. So if the Ukrainians are not showing progress by the Russians in one location or another, they assume that there is no progress by the Russians in that location. If the Ukrainians talk about a counterattack, well, it's assumed that some kind of counterattack has taken place. I understand that one of the reasons for this is that the Ukrainians produce an awful lot more information about the situation on the battlefronts, many more videos, many more commentaries on social media than people close to the battlefronts, the Russian battlefronts, do. And that undoubtedly is because the Russian Defense Ministry and the Russian General Staff insist upon running a much tighter ship than the Ukrainian political and military leadership do. Russian soldiers, for example, are prohibited from carrying mobile phones when they're on the battlefronts. So the result is that we have less information from the Russians, and in order to fill the gap, inevitably people turn to what the Ukrainians say, and inevitably that means that we get a skewed picture of events. Anyway, with all that set aside, we can draw some conclusions, and we can, of course, talk about events on the battlefronts, and with the caveat, as I said, that there's less information coming through in the last few hours, probably because the Ukrainians, for their own reasons, are providing us with less information. Anyway, with that caveat, let me make a few general observations about where I think we are. Firstly, there remains the mystery as to what exactly it is that the Russians are doing in Kherson or the Dnieper River. In my program yesterday, I mentioned that film had appeared which showed Russian soldiers on the west bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region. There was some discussion as to whether this was an advance party ahead of some major Russian military operation in Kherson region, or whether it was just some kind of reconnaissance group probing the state of Ukrainian defenses and perhaps trying to throw the Ukrainians off balance, or what it was exactly. Anyway, there's been no follow-up to that story, except that the Russians do now seem to have further control of some of the islands. There's been more reports about this. There were more reports about this over the last 24 hours. But then, of course, that in turn begs the question, more control over the islands, to what purpose exactly? Why are the Russians so interested at this time in controlling the islands in the Dnieper? Now, the other thing to say is that, as I discussed yesterday, the largest group of forces amongst the various group of forces of the Russian army that are operating in Ukraine is, according to the Ukrainians, group of forces Dnieper, commanded by General Teplinsky, one of Russia's best battlefield commanders. Now, when I say he's one of the best, he's acknowledged to be such by the Russians. And I remember back in the autumn of 2022, noticing this extremely skillful way in which he managed the defense of Kherson region, the area of Kherson region on the west bank of the Dnieper, west of the city of Kherson itself, against very much more numerous Ukrainian forces, equipped at that time with the new HIMARS missiles. He performed remarkably well, keeping a stable defense line and preventing the Ukrainians advancing to Kherson. Of course, the Russians eventually decided to withdraw from Kherson. This was a decision that was made by the Russian General Staff and by General Surovikin, because the view that existed in Moscow at that time, almost certainly correct view, was that the Russians were overextended and that it made little sense to keep a large force of Russian troops, around 20,000, under Teplinsky, fighting a lonely battle west of the Dnieper River, where they weren't achieving anything useful. So the Russian General Staff, the Russian military, against the wishes of the politicians, insisted and eventually managed to get the Russian forces, to pull back to the East Bank. But in the meantime, whilst they were there, Teplinsky fought an extremely skilled, I would even say masterful, defensive operation, which, by the way, I discussed extensively in my videos made at that time. So he is there in command of group of forces Dnieper, a force which, according to the Ukrainians, numbers around 130,000 men. They are in Kherson region and in Zaporozhye region. And, well, they have so far been, if not exactly idle, certainly a lot less active than all of the other group of forces involved in the conflict, which make up the Russian army there. They've been a lot less active than they have been. And, of course, that begs the question, why? Well, on the one hand, the Russians no doubt do feel that they need a significant army in Kherson region because of repeated Ukrainian threats to attack Crimea, and group of forces Dnieper, with its 130,000 men, provides an impregnable barrier for any Ukrainian advance on Crimea. But is such an advance, such an operation by Ukraine seriously threatened at the moment? The Ukrainians are incredibly overextended. There was a most fascinating article yesterday by Redovka, Russian newspaper. I've discussed it many times, based in Smolensk, very much on the nationalist side of the Russian political spectrum, strongly supportive of the special military operation. But clearly it has people with military backgrounds on its staff, and it has a large team of reporters who travel around the battle lines and keep it informed about what is going on. And, well, based on what all of these reporters are saying and what their own analysts are saying, Redovka did its own analysis of the state of the battle lines at the present time. And, well, it didn't tell us anything very original. In fact, you could almost say that it was identical to one that I've expressed many times on these programs. This is that the Russians have the initiative all across the entire line of contact, a line of contact which extends over perhaps 1,000 kilometers, that the Russians are able to keep the Ukrainians guessing all the time about where the main axis of their attack will come, that the Ukrainians have a steadily reducing number of increasingly exhausted and run down elite brigades, that they're having to shuttle back from one part of the front lines to another, that whenever the Russians push and encounter resistance because the Ukrainians have redeployed forces from one part of the battlefront to a point where it might seem that the Russians are about to conduct a breakthrough, that the Russians then push harder on that part of the front lines which the Ukrainians have taken forces from and which has, as a result, become weaker. And that the Ukrainians, or General Syrsky, as Redovka pointed out, he's after all the overall Ukrainian military commander, have been reduced over the last few months to a juggling act, juggling increasingly tired and exhausted brigades, running short increasingly of military equipment, that they've been reduced to moving these brigades around the battlefronts, exploiting Ukraine's advantage in that it still has what logisticians call the interior lines. In other words, it still has the primary benefit of the railways and road links in this area. So the Ukrainians are obliged to do this, but of course they're paying a very high price for doing so, because their reserves get reduced and depleted with each passing day, and the brigades, as they get shuttled around, become increasingly tired. So are the Ukrainians, faced with this kind of problem, seriously in a position at the moment to conduct an operation across the Dnieper in Kherson region, such as would seriously threaten Crimea? Well, I think the Russians, after the events in Kursk region last month, are not going to let themselves be caught by surprise. They will obviously keep a significant force in Kherson region. But General Teplinsky's group of forces, Dnieper, is so big that he can presumably afford to do that and still conduct somewhere an offensive of its own. Maybe it is, in fact, considering an attack on Kherson region, an assault across the Dnieper River. It would be a strange time to do it, in my opinion. We now have autumn coming. There will be the rains fairly soon. The Dnieper will presumably be most full of water. Might not be the right time for a cross-river operation. But then the Russians have shown skill in this kind of thing, and they may be calculating that precisely because these weather conditions are difficult, the Ukrainians won't accept it. Of course, similar weather conditions didn't deter the Ukrainians from conducting or trying to conduct their own operation across the Dnieper River in Krinky at exactly this time last year. But that was a complete disaster, and I'm sure the Russians don't treat that as an example of what they should do. But anyway, maybe that is what General Teplinsky and his staff and the general staff in Moscow are planning. But then if we go back to Redovka, they were also talking in a completely separate article about the group of forces Dnieper, the Russian troops, now starting to resume an advance north of Rabotino, this village that the Ukrainians spent so much time and so much effort seeking to capture during their summer offensive of 2023, that they fought for at such terrible cost, which they occupied, but according to the Russians, never fully consolidated control of, and which the Russians recaptured a couple of weeks ago. Anyway, according to this Redovka report, the Russians are now starting to edge northwards. They're starting to edge northwards from Rabotino, and there's all sorts of there's two important villages close to Rabotino, which are under Ukrainian control, but the ultimate objective is the town of Orekhov. The town which was the launch pad of Ukraine's 2023 summer offensive, apparently devastated by bombing. The Ukrainians in this area now supposedly short of troops. If the Russians attack Orekhov, the Ukrainian lines will become again even further extended. Orekhov probably is a position, a town the Ukrainians will not want to lose, because its loss not only brings the Russians again closer to the Dnieper, but it brings them closer to the city of Zaporozhye itself, which Putin and the Russian authorities consider to be Russian, since it is the capital of Zaporozhye, which is, of course, as far as the Russians are concerned, Russian national territory since September 2022. Anyway, we will see what happens. But again, we have complete lack of certainty as to what, if anything, the Russians are doing in this area. But I'm going to express my own opinion. Sooner or later, they are going to do something. I do not believe that the Russians are going to leave their largest group of forces, commanded by one of their most able generals. I'm sure that they're not going to leave them idle for very much longer. At some point over the next few weeks or months, this part of the battlefront field is going to be activated by the Russians, and activated with a vengeance. And by the way, I believe that the Russians already have more troops in this area, and many more tanks and armored vehicles and aircraft and drones than the Ukrainians did at the time when they launched their summer offensive in this very same area in 2023. Now, we've had no news at all from either the Vremivka salient area or from Velikaya Novosilka, the village just north of the Vremivka salient, which the Russians are now very close to. And we've not had any news either from Vuhledar. We've had no news either from the Ukrainians or from the Russians. The very last film I saw is of Russian bombs falling on Velikaya Novosilka, which is usually a sign that some kind of attack against a place is being prepared, though there is often a long gap between the moment when the bombs fall and the attack is launched. Now, the fact that we have no news from the Vuhledar area does not mean that nothing is happening in the Vuhledar area. In fact, there was a report yesterday that the Russians, having recently made significant progress in this area, in the Vuhledar area, that they are now pushing north and that they're trying to capture a village called Novogrodivka, which I believe is located northwest of Vuhledar. And if the Russians do capture Novogrodivka, and they've also been storming Vuhledar, and might indeed have captured that village already, well then, if they capture these two villages, Vuhledar is surrounded. It is an actual trap. One would be justified here in talking about a cauldron, and heavens knows what will happen to the Ukrainian troops, who, by the way, still include the 72nd Brigade, who are trying to defend themselves in this place. So I just mentioned this. It's not clear what's going on in Vuhledar, but to repeat once more, when we don't get news from a particular part of the battlefronts, it's usually a sign that the Russians are tightening control of information, because that tends to be what happens when they are engaged in an offensive. And it is also a sign, when the Ukrainians tighten control of information, that things are not going well. Now, further north, the situation is, if anything, even more interesting, because we do have now this very complex battle that is underway, involving Ukrainsk, where the Russians, by nearly all reports, are fighting inside Ukrainsk. They've recently captured the village immediately to the east of Ukrainsk. There are some reports that there are Russian troops or reconnaissance groups that have actually moved south from Ukrainsk towards Girnik. Anyway, there is a lot of information from this area, and there's also claims that the Russians have captured the village of Zelanye Pershe, a little to the east. Anyway, there's a lot of reports as to what exactly is happening. There are reports that the Russians have trapped a brigade of the Ukrainian army that is located immediately to the east of Ukrainsk. It's apparently surrounded, or almost surrounded, or at least perhaps surrounded on three sides, between the Russian forces that are storming Ukrainsk and the Russians who are in Galitsinivka and Zelanye Pershe. So there's some kind of battle going on there. Apparently there's been reports from the men of this brigade that they are in a critical situation. Exact details have not been provided. And there are further reports, I think they're now essentially confirmed, that the Russians have completed the capture of every remaining building in Krasnogorovka, including the entire area of the two streets that jutted out of Krasnogorovka towards the west. And again, we're hearing reports that there are Ukrainian troops in the area west of Nivolskoye and north of Krasnogorovka, who are surrounded in the fields. It's difficult to know exactly what is going on. The Ukrainians have been talking about how these troops have abandoned their positions in Nivolskoye, which is very interesting and very surprising because the Ukrainians, the Russians captured Novoskoye some weeks ago. Then there were claims that the Ukrainians had recaptured the village. Then there were claims that the Russians had taken it back. And now these very latest reports are saying that the Ukrainians have withdrawn from the village. So maybe the Ukrainians always had some kind of a presence in the village, or maybe it was contested, or perhaps, and this seems to me completely illogical and makes no sense at all, no strategic sense, the Ukrainians in these fields were still trying to attack and drive the Russians out of the village. Why they would want to control a village like Novoskoye when all of the area around to the north, places like Netailevo, Pervomayske, all of these places had fallen under Russian control, Krasnogorovka to the south. Why the Ukrainians wanted to cling on to Novoskoye makes absolutely no sense to me at all. It was at the far eastern end of what was becoming an increasingly precarious salient. I am completely at a loss to understand. Maybe some of their long-range artillery was still located in this area, some of their multiple launch rocket systems and their very long-range guns, and they were clinging on to Novoskoye because by doing so, they're still able from time to time to launch artillery and missile strikes on Donetsk city, which is not that far away from this territory. If so, that demonstrates the extent to which shelling of Donetsk, as well as being a war crime, has become a complete obsession for the Ukrainian command, and the fantastic lengths that they are prepared to go, to which they're prepared to go, in order to continue doing it. But anyway, assuming that is true, and all of this is speculative and it's a guess, it looks as if the Ukrainians have now finally had to push back, been pushed out of Novoskoye, but it seems that there has been still no general retreat of the Ukrainians from these fields, even as the trap around them is closing. And I've said previously, I'm not convinced that the Russians really were planning to trap these Ukrainian troops in these fields. It would be an overambitious and over-costly operation from a Russian perspective. And yet, apparently, because the Ukrainians are so unwilling to retreat from these fields, that it seems is exactly what is happening. Anyway, there's been apparently more adjustments on the map based on geolocations of various pictures and films in this area. The cumulative effect of these is that they show more of the fields and territories in this area gradually passing under Russian control. I'm not going to pretend that I understand fully all of the details. Maybe we need to focus more on what's going on in Ukrainsk and in the area of Girnik, just to the south of Ukrainsk, and that the fighting is the fighting there that really matters. On that topic, a member of the Duran community who's been writing to me on a fairly regular basis about military matters and whose opinions about the war I've come to place great weight on. I don't always agree with him, but whatever he says has always appeared to me to be intelligent and well-founded. Anyway, this person, who, by the way, I ought to stress, has a military background, is saying that we've now come to a point in this conflict where, for the Russians, gaining control of positions, of territory, in fact, is starting to matter. It's not that they've left attrition behind. It's rather that gaining territory, gaining positions, gaining control of places like Ukrainsk and Girnik and Zelanie Pershe and Zelanie Drucha and all that, negate the effect of attrition. It's that rather these territorial gains and the attrition complement each other. They go hand in hand. So just saying. On that basis, by the way, I've seen some Ukrainian commentaries talking with growing alarm about the situation, talking about how the Russians, by capturing Ukrainsk and perhaps Girnik, are in the process of conducting an outflanking maneuver, preparing to take Selidovo further north from the rear to encircle or semi-encircle the Ukrainian troops there and to start interfering with the railway lines and the road lines and the other supply routes into Selidovo. And this is coming from Ukrainian commentators who seem to be closely connected to the events on the ground. And that, of course, tallies exactly with what Redovka was saying about a week ago when it discussed the importance of the village of Tsukurinye, which lies west of Ukrainsk, and which they believe after Ukrainsk and Girnik have fallen will be the next and perhaps the decisive Russian objective. About the fighting in Selidovo, what Redovka was reporting 2 days ago has now become the universally accepted view, which is that the Russians pull their troops back from the southern area of Selidovo. They pull them back to the village of Mikhailovka. There are apparently, however, still Russian troops located in the north of Selidovo, south of the slag heap, the giant slag heap and the coal mine, which, if true, must mean that the slag heap and the coal mine are under Russian control. There have been, as some people pointed out, no pictures of the slag heap and the coal mine. Neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians have produced any. Some assume that that means that the slag heap and the coal mine are under Ukrainian control. I don't know. I am not there. I would have thought that if the Ukrainians were still in control of the slag heap, they would have said so and provided us with film or pictures to confirm that. Maybe there is fighting on the slag heap and for the coal mine still underway, and that there is an ongoing battle, and that's why neither side wants to talk about this. But if it is true, and again let me stress, I am not there, if it is true that the Russians have taken positions in northern Selidovo, then logically they must control the coal mine and the slag heap, or at least most of it. That seems to me obvious if we look at a map. Now, that then brings us back to what's going on in the battle for Mikhailovka. There is a lot of fighting apparently going on for Mikhailovka. The Ukrainians have been making big efforts to try to push the Russians back from Mikhailovka. The Russians have been resisting. Both sides have been sending reinforcements to this village. Mikhailovka is, of course, the village immediately to the west of Selidovo. It is, properly speaking, a suburb of Selidovo itself. The importance of this village is that it lies on the main road, the main supply road from Donetsk to Pokrovsk. As I've discussed in many programs, I think a priority for the Russians is to secure control of this highway before they launch their offensive towards Pokrovsk. Presumably, the Ukrainians want to stop that happening. For the Russians, control of Mikhailovka is therefore essential. For the Ukrainians, recapture of Mikhailovka is equally essential. In this area of the battlefronts, ultimately the Russians have the advantage, and though it may take them time, as it did, for example, without all that fighting for Sportwear and BITCHUTE near Avdiivka all those weeks and months ago, sooner or later they will consolidate control over Mikhailovka and push the Ukrainians out and eventually bring Selidovo under their control. Now, saying all of that, again, I doubt that it will take as long as some people think, even if the Russians have work to do to bring the coal mine and the slag heap under their control. Sooner or later, probably sooner rather than later, they will do it. Once the fighting for Ukrainsk and Girnik and all of these places has been resolved in their favor, the Russians will push on and complete the battle for Selidovo and bring this place fully under their control. In the meantime, the Russians are doing that which they always do, which is they're bombing Selidovo relentlessly. They're focusing on all the main supply routes into Selidovo, the railway lines and the roads. They're bombing these positions with artillery and aviation. They're aircraft, in other words, dropping fab bombs. They're bombing all of these places with their long-range missiles. And of course, their drone forces are very, very active along all of these supply roads. And the Ukrainians have suffered massive armoured vehicle losses precisely in this area of the Pokrovsk offensive. And gradually what the Russians aim to do is to to suffocate the Ukrainian defenders in places like Selidovo, to make the sending of supplies to these places impossible, and that in turn makes the defense of places like Selidovo for the Ukrainians ultimately impossible as well. So just saying. Now, this morning, shortly before I started making this program, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that Novogrodivka, the town of Novogrodivka, town of 17,000 people, back in the early 2000s, that Novogrodivka is indeed fully under Russian control. There continues to be claims that the Ukrainians are defending the coal mine and slag heap to the west of Novogrodivka. And there are claims that there are fierce battles taking place for control of Novogrodivka, which may, of course, for control of this particular coal mine, which may be true, though again, one can't confirm that. But there are also reports that the Russians are advancing northwest of Novogrodivka towards a place called Chasov Yar, and that appears to be part of the Russians preparing their general offensive eventually towards Pokrovsk itself. Again, I'm not going to pretend that I fully understand the nature of all of these battles, but Chasov Yar is another place, a village called Lisivka, which is located, it's a large village by the map, immediately to the south of Chasov Yar. If Chasov Yar and Lisivka fall under Russian control, Then, with the Russians apparently indisputably in control of Chasiv Yar, which is located to the northeast of Novogrodivka. I believe, by the way, that they also control Krasny Yar, which is located a little to the north, and perhaps Mykolaievka also. Well, if the Russians are in control of all of these places, Suhy Yar, Lysivka, Krasny Yar, Chasiv Yar, Mikhailovka, Grodivka itself, where recently more film appears to confirm that the Russians are in control of Grodivka. Well, we can see that the Russians, in that case, will have established a broad front, a force of villages that they would control immediately south of Mirnograd and ultimately of Pokrovsk itself. There might still be various places that they would want to capture. There are a number of villages to the west of Lysivka, along the same road, by the way, that leads from Donetsk city and which passes through Karlovka and Mikhailovka that I was talking about. There's villages like Dachinske, Zelenie, another Novoukrainka, Chunishinie, Novopavlivka. Perhaps the Russians will want to capture all of these villages as soon as they've finished with Suhy Yar and Lysivka. And as I said previously, there are villages to the north that the Russians will also no doubt want to capture. Vozvizhenka, Yelizavetivka, Mirolyubivka, Malinivka, Novoekonomichke. Once all of these villages are captured, and this is something that will take some weeks, the main offensive, the main assault on Pokrovsk and Mirnograd will begin. And in fact, at that point, the defenses of this town will become, of Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, the defenses of these places will become unsustainable. So anyway, lots, as I said, of fog of war here. But again, it's not difficult to get a sense of the overall trends of events. Ukrainian soldiers in the area seem to be deeply despondent and are still complaining about lack of men, ammunition, and machines of war, tanks, and armored vehicles. Redovka made a rather contemptuous comment about the current state of the Ukrainian army, and it was in the same article in which it discussed about the way in which Syrsky and the Ukrainian command is having to juggle brigades from one part of the battle lines to another. They said, and this is, bear in mind, this is a Russian newspaper, that the state of the Ukrainian army now is that we're talking about a force that essentially consists of light infantry, very little armor, relatively little artillery, relatively little ammunition for that artillery. It's a light infantry force that now moves essentially on passenger vehicles, moves from one place to another. It's a cheap force to keep maintained, but obviously a force that suffers incredibly heavy losses when it comes up against the mechanized and armored forces that make up the Russian army. Now, Redovka is almost certainly overstating things. Ukraine still has quite a lot of armor left, or some armor left, and of course it continues to get some from the West, but it's the kind of dismissive comment that I suspect contains a grain of truth. And it means, by the way, that increasingly, when the fighting moves away from the urban areas and into the fields, the open fields, the steppe land, the Ukrainian infantry, unprotected by armour and artillery, is now at a terrible disadvantage. Anyway, that's the situation in the Pokrovsk area. In the Toretsk area, I understand that the Russians continue to make progress in Toretsk itself, but there's been a lot of comment now in the various reporting channels about the Ukrainian success, if that's exactly what it is. One of the Ukrainian telegram channels, a telegram channel's resident, was deeply skeptical about this, but about the success of the 12th Azov Brigade in breaking through to the industrial area of New York and either relieving and arranging the evacuation of the Ukrainian troops there, or alternatively perhaps, and this astonishingly is something that apparently some Ukrainians are saying that they now plan to do, trying to reinforce them there. And all kinds of pictures have appeared, pointing out how, if this is indeed the plan, if this is indeed what the 12th Azov Brigade is trying to do, then it is actually maneuvering itself into another trap, another cauldron, because the road area, the narrow road that it has carved through the Russian defences to reach this industrial area of New York is incredibly narrow and can be cut by the Russians. And of course, if it is cut by the Russians, then even more Ukrainian troops would find themselves in this actual cauldron in the industrial area than had been the case before. In that case, by the way, it reminds me of an episode that Brian Beletic on the New Atlas repeatedly refers to, which I remember very well, which took place during the siege of Aleppo in Syria in 2016, 2016. The Ukrainians, not the Ukrainians, the jihadi fighters who were fighting there, briefly managed to punch a hole through the Syrian lines that were besieging the jihadi fighters in southern Aleppo. This was massively talked up in the Western media as a huge triumph and a great success. It proved to be only an ephemeral win. It proved impossible to keep this small supply line open. Instead of evacuating the fighters who were in southern Aleppo, they chose to reinforce them, and that ultimately made the collapse when it came in Aleppo even greater. Brian Beletic has often cited this event in order to warn people, entirely correctly, that ephemeral gains actually mean nothing in a war of this kind. He's absolutely right to do this, and I suspect this event in New York is like that. Since I am on the topic of Brian Beletic, I would, by the way, strongly recommend watching his latest program on the New Atlas, in which he discusses at length the various promises the West has made to provide Ukraine with weapon systems that actually don't exist. It's one of, actually, he's been doing a lot of good programs recently, but it's one of the ones that I found most interesting. Anyway, there we go. So that's the situation in New York. Because of all of the interest and focus that there has been on this so-called breakthrough by the 12th Assault Brigade, the Azov Brigade, the larger battle of New York, of Toretsk, the one that really matters, has attracted less interest. Now, further north, in Chasiv Yar, exactly what I have been saying has proved to be true. Again, for several weeks, in fact, we were not getting reports from Chasiv Yar. This led to all kinds of assumptions that the fighting in Chasiv Yar had died down and had been reduced. I said that this was almost certainly wrong. I said that we would perhaps soon find that the Russians had established themselves in places in Chasiv Yar far beyond the recognized front lines. And over the last 2 days, we're getting further confirmation of this. Now, the information is very sketchy, but we are now getting more reports which show the Russians occupying large areas of central Chasiv Yar. I'm not again going to say that they control all of it. I mean, they clearly don't. There are clearly still Ukrainian troops fighting in central Chasiv Yar. But it's clear that the Russians control, I'm guessing, around 60% of Chasiv Yar, of the central core residential area of Chasiv Yar. But we've now had reports that the Russians are actually to the northwest of these positions, that they actually control a hill located immediately to the north of Chasiv Yar and well to the west of where anybody had previously located them, and that they are now in a position to launch an attack, a mass attack, presumably with tanks and backed by artillery, to storm Ukrainian positions in the western suburbs of Chasiv Yar, one that is a northern spur, which I believe is mostly residential, high-rise buildings. Apparently people have seen Ukrainian tanks there facing northwards, preparing to repel the Russian advance from the hill, the northern positions that the Russians have taken. But also perhaps an industrial area that lies immediately to the south of this area as well. Once the Russians have cleared the central area of Chasiv Yar and these two residential blocks, Chasiv Yar will have fallen. And the end of that battle, the battle for Chasiv Yar, which has been underway for some time, will have come. Chasiv Yar has been a difficult battle for the Russians. It was the place that they needed to capture after they captured Bakhmut. They had to put the fight for Chasiv Yar on hold, partly because of the complicated way in which Prigozhin ended Wagner's operation in Bakhmut in May 2023. Then the Russians, of course, had to address the many problems created for them by Ukraine's summer 2023 counteroffensive, which happened both in southern region, in Zaporozhye and Kherson region, but also, by the way, in the area around Bakhmut. So the Russians had to deal with all of that, and they have only seriously begun the advance towards Chasiv Yar in the first months, weeks of this year. And there was lots of difficult fighting that they needed to do to capture places like villages, fortified villages like Khromovo, Bogdanovka and Ivanivka that lay in their way. And then, of course, Chasiv Yar itself is on something of a hill, and the Russians had to advance up that hill. They had to capture the micro-district, which lay to the east of the Seversky Donets aqueduct. The aqueduct itself is a barrier. They had to cross that barrier and then reach the central areas of Chasiv Yar, keeping their troops supplied in these places. So it's been a complex and very difficult battle. But my sense is that it is now starting to come to an end. And of course, as I discussed in a recent program that I made, the Russians, having now pushed west from Klishevka and Andreevka to the Seversky Donets aqueduct, are actually close, remarkably very close to the city of Konstantinovka, which is presumably their next objective from after Chasiv Yar. Once they have captured Chasiv Yar, completed the capture of Chasiv Yar, they will control the high ground. They can advance on Konstantinovka from the north, from Chasiv Yar itself. They can advance on Konstantinovka from the east by crossing the Seversky Donets aqueduct, where they've reached it west of Klishevka and Andreevka. And when Toretsk falls, they can advance on Konstantinovka from the south, from Toretsk as well. By the way, if they're minded to, they can also send forces from Ocheretino along the main road, and they can advance on Konstantinovka from the west also, advancing, in other words, on Konstantinovka from multiple directions and also cutting the supply roads. To say it straightforwardly, once Chasiv Yar falls, I think that the battle for Konstantinovka, city of around 70,000 people, will be relatively short. Anyway, there we are. So that's the situation along the old contact line. Now, even Ukrainian sources are now starting to acknowledge that in Kursk region, the Ukrainians are on the defensive, have now been thrown back onto the defensive. And Abdiel Aldinov, the Chechen officer, commander of the Akhmat Special Forces, he has confirmed as much. Group of forces north have provided, of course, their own update of the fighting. And this is what it says. It says that we continue to push the Ukrainian armed forces out of Kursk region step by step. The most significant advances are observed in the area of Korenov. The enemy made one attempt at a counterattack with up to 10 men, of whom 5 were killed, and had no success. We are also advancing in the Malaya Lochnia area. The Ukrainian forces are resisting and have carried out one counterattack with up to 10 fighters and an armoured fighting vehicle. The attack was repelled. The enemy's losses amounted to 5 enemy soldiers killed, 3 wounded, an armoured fighting vehicle burnt, and an armoured fighting vehicle burnt. In the south of Suja, counter battles continue in the area of the settlement of Cherkasskaya Konopielka. Over the past day, fighters of the group of forces north have destroyed up to 11 enemy troops, a tank, and an infantry fighting vehicle in this section of the front. Overall, our advance in the Kursk region amounted to 400 meters. And then they go on to say that against the background of the loss of positions in Kursk, the enemy has intensified reconnaissance activities on the border of Belgorod region over the course of 24 hours. Air defense crews of Group of Forces North have shot down 8 enemy reconnaissance drones. Whether the Ukrainian armed forces have the strength to open a new front is an open question. Indirectly, this can be judged by the increased number of videos of forced mobilization in Ukrainian cities. And then there is a quote, this time from Marshal Zhukov: "Time has no power over the greatness of anything we experienced during war, and the people who once experienced great trials will continue to draw strength from this victory." Anyway, so what Group of Forces North are telling us is that they're on the offensive throughout the entirety of Kursk region. They're pushing the Ukrainians from Korenovo. They're pushing the Ukrainians back from the area of the village of Malaya Lochnia, and they're pushing the Ukrainians back in the area in the southwestern area close to Suja. The Ukrainians are making counterattacks, occasional counterattacks, but they're not successful. Now, something has happened over the last 24 hours, which I find both unsurprising and to some extent frustrating. There's been a lot of talk about the Ukrainians trying to surround a Russian force in Malaya Lochnia. And in my program yesterday, I said that a lot of these talk about this attempted encirclement of the Russians in Malaya Lochnia hinged on the assumption that the Ukrainians control the villages of Ruskoye Porechnoye and Cherkaskoye Porechnoye. And as I pointed out, on many occasions, Group of Forces North and the Russian Defense Ministry repeatedly speak about these two villages as if they were actually under Russian control. So yesterday, pictures appeared showing Russian troops in Cherkaskoye Porechnoye. And the various mapping projects that have been placing Cherkaskoye Porechnoye under Ukrainian control assume that there's been some kind of Russian attack against the Ukrainians in Cherkaskoye Porechnoye, and that the Russians have either captured all or part of this village back from the Ukrainians. Well, perhaps that is what's happened, but isn't it at least possible that these reports that the Russian Defense Ministry and Group of Forces North have been giving us have been true, and that it is the Russians who have always been in control of Cherkaskoye Porechnoye and, by the way, Ruskoye Porechnoye further north? For many weeks, the various mapping projects all claimed that Malaya Lochnia was under Ukrainian control. In fact, I remember seeing a map produced by the Institute for the Study of War only last week, which showed Malaya Lochnia well inside Ukrainian-controlled territory. In fact, Malaya Lochnia was recaptured by the Russians, according to Redovka, roughly 2 weeks before, and we've had lots of reports from Group of Forces North and from the Russian Defense Ministry speaking of that village being under Russian control and of the Ukrainians trying to capture it. So, if the reports of Ukrainian control of Cherkaskoye Porechnoye were wrong, it would not be something new. This brings me back to the problem of geolocations. When there is an encounter battle, when there are battles because a force from one side or the other is attempting to storm a particular village, then inevitably, whilst that encounter battle is underway, you will find pictures of the troops of the force that's trying to storm the village in the village. That doesn't mean that they have control of the village, or that if they do enter the village, they're able to remain there for very long. So the fact that we've had at various times many pictures of Ukrainian troops and armoured vehicles fighting, or at least in position in various parts of Cherkasskoye Porechnoye and Rurskoye Porechnoye, does not mean, and in my opinion has never meant, axiomatically, that those villages are or were under Ukrainian control. In every case, when that claim has been made, when those pictures have appeared, they have coincided with reports of fierce encounter battles for these villages coming from official Russian sources, from the Russian Defense Ministry, from Group of Forces North, and indeed from people like Abdi Alaudinov, and by the way from Radovka as well. I'm not sure why there continues to be this bias in assuming that Ukrainian claims in these battles are necessarily true, or that the pictures and film that the Ukrainians produce necessarily give us the complete picture. Just saying. Anyway, never mind. The fact is that Group of Forces North are telling us that the Russians are on the advance. They're on the advance in the area of Korenovo, and no one disputes that anymore. And the Group of Forces North tell us that the Russians are also advancing in the Malaya Lochnia area, and that all attempts by the Ukrainians to resist are unsuccessful. There is no hint here of any encirclement of Russian troops in Malaya Lochnia. That did take place, but it happened roughly 2 weeks ago, and the Russians at the time said that particular encirclement was broken. Now, interestingly, on the situation in Kharkiv region, in Volchansk, the situation appears to be different. According to Group of Forces North, there's still intense fighting going on in Volchansk. My sense is that the Russian advance in Volchansk has again slowed down. The Group of Forces North says this: over the course of 24 hours, we repelled 4 attacks by the Ukrainian armed forces in the direction of the high-rise buildings and in the east of the city, and also disrupted 3 redeployments of reserves across the Volcha River. The enemy's losses amounted to 20 troops in the Staritsa area, another place, by the way, which many mapping projects still show under Ukrainian control. But anyway, our drone crews worked effectively, destroying up to 10 enemy personnel with FPV drones. And Group of Forces North say the enemy is regrouping in the Lipsy area. We identified rotation routes and carried out pinpoint strikes with artillery and drones, destroying up to 10 Ukrainian troops. So, for the moment, perhaps as they sense that their hold on Sudzha and the surrounding villages in Kursk region is weakening, the Ukrainians have stepped up their attempts to defend themselves in Volchansk, and I get the sense that the Russian advance there, has now slowed to a crawl, or perhaps come to a complete stop. But if so, it would be the only area at the moment where it seems that the Russians are not advancing. Anyway, there we are. That is the situation on the front lines. There's been lots of missile strikes and other attacks of that kind across the battlefields. But that is where we stand in this war, in the military aspects of this war, which have been the main topic of this program as of today. It's an unstable, dynamic situation in Pokrovsk, but the trajectory of travel, as I've said, is clear. In Chasiv Yar, it looks like a major breakthrough is underway. And in Kursk, the Ukrainians are clearly now on the defensive and falling back. Every day, the Ukrainians suffer appalling losses, and there doesn't seem to be any real prospect of that being reversed. I've had, by the way, more discussions this time from more people about the effectiveness of the JASSMs, I hope I'm pronouncing them correctly, missiles. An Air Force, a person who's had an Air Force background, I'm not going to say, by the way, in which Air Force, just saying, because this is all very confidential. He's also come back to me on the question of the JASSMs. I discussed some things that another commentator has said. This person has provided a lot of detail about how, both about how the JASSMs operate and about the means that the Russians might have to shoot these missiles down. He takes a midway position between myself and the previous commentator. The previous commentator thought it most unlikely that the Russians would be able to shoot down these missiles. This commentator, who has a much more qualified position to speak on this, he thinks that the Russians will find it more difficult to shoot down these missiles than they find it to shoot down Storm Shadows, that this is a more challenging missile for the Russians to shoot down. But he nonetheless does think that the Russians can shoot it down. And perhaps over time they will. We will see. Anyway, regardless of that, what we see is, I would suggest, a clear trajectory of travel. The situation on the battlefields continues to deteriorate. But new thinking about the war in Kiev, in Washington, in London, nowhere to be found. I had a very depressed sense after listening to the heads of the CIA and of MI6 participate in a joint discussion, I believe in London, hosted by the Financial Times. They spoke about the operation in Kursk, the Ukrainian operation in Kursk, which has been, in my opinion, a catastrophic error by the Ukrainians and a developing debacle. They spoke about it being a bold, imaginative move. They said that the attack in Kursk had shaken elite belief in Russia, in Putin. At the same time, they admitted, at least the CIA director, Bill Burns, admitted that there was no sign that Putin's grip was weakening in Russia in any way, even though that grip was somehow still unstable. I have no understanding of how these two completely contradictory claims can be made and reconciled with each other. How can a grip be both firm, a political grip, be both firm and unstable? I mean, it makes absolutely no sense to me. There was much discussion already some discussion about Russian threats to use nuclear weapons. The narrative has again was floated that the United States believed that the Russians were on the brink of using tactical nuclear weapons in the autumn of 2022. For the record, I saw no sign of it at the time. I've seen no sign of it since. The Russians have repeatedly denied it. The circumstances in autumn 2023 did not, in my opinion, in any way point to it. I think this is a completely invented story. But anyway, the CIA director and the head of MI6 brought it up all over again. They spoke about the threat from China, that China is the major geopolitical threat. They talked about the fact that the Russians continue to conduct sabotage and all of these things in Europe, but provided, I thought, very thin evidence to substantiate those claims. I was searching and looking for some minuscule sign that these two senior intelligence officials were prepared to rethink the war and might be prepared to discuss some route back towards achieving peace, that they might be preparing to acknowledge the current military realities. Of that, I saw no sign whatsoever. None. By the way, for the record, the tone and mood, both of their comments and of the meeting in general, there was some, I thought, frankly, inappropriate laughter from the audience when the topic of nuclear weapons in the autumn of 2022 was discussed. Anyway, never mind. The whole tone of the meeting still suggested to me that this whole conflict from the Western side has been more intelligence run, in other words, driven more by the intelligence agencies than it has been by the militaries, by the military at least of the United States, which I get the sense has many people who all along have been deeply skeptical of this adventure. On the part of the intelligence agencies, I saw no sign of any skepticism about it, any doubts about it at all. I do wonder whether the advice that the US President, and now the US Vice President, who may succeed him, whether the advice they're getting from the CIA, from the analysts there, from the people who brief them from the CIA, whether the advice the new Prime Minister in Britain, Keir Starmer, is getting from MI6 about the war, whether they're any different from what we heard at this meeting hosted by the Financial Times. I very much fear not, in which case it is entirely unsurprising that the war is going the way it is, with the results that we will someday see. Someday, not so far off, at least not in my opinion. But anyway, there it is. That's where we are. That's where we are in this war. I'll be returning to this topic, and I hope others. Middle East is a little quieter for the moment, though I suspect this is only a momentary quiet. Much more is to come. Anyway, I will be returning to this war, to the various other issues that are taking place around the world in future programs, but where this is where this program ends. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to the shop, links under this video. And don't forget, in the meantime, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.